what is stress? And then what is traumatic stress? And what's the difference between the two and experiencing both?
Okay, so one of the things that I try to do in my publications and in my own teaching of others about stress is that psychologists often conflate two terms. One is the event of a stressor, and the other one is the response of stress. So when people say, I'm stressed, sometimes they mean that horrible, stressful things are happening to them, and sometimes they mean that their bodies are reacting to those events. So sometimes the stressor can be quite mild, but their response to it is could be more than mild, moderate, or extreme. And sometimes the stressor is can be severe, but they're not stressed out, right? So in terms of the definition of stress, you can think of stress as coming from really the field of engineering, where people were looking at how much pressure can a bridge take of traffic before the bridge would crumble and crash. And so when you think of it like that, it really does make sense that stress is this pressure that is put upon a person, and how much can they take before they break or crumble. So a stressor is anything that puts that challenge on an organism, that challenges that organism in some way. A traumatic stressor is one that uh, probably comes at a pretty fast clip. It's either very sudden and it's out of the ordinary oftentimes, and it challenges the organism in a way that the organism wasn't ready to respond yet. So if you think of traumatic stressors like torture, those are completely out of the ordinary. And then we have stressors that are daily stressors. They're not out of the ordinary, unfortunately, like child abuse. Unfortunately, is not out of the ordinary, but it takes so much out of that little child, that little organism, to respond, especially if the trauma is being perpetrated by somebody they love, like their parent. So, in those instances, the traumatic response is one of both bewilderment, right? How can somebody who loves me treat me this way? And then the response of, oh, maybe this is what love is. So that they incorporate that into their understandings of love and care. So I don't know if I answered your question, but stress, a stressor, an everyday stressor, is something that we probably won't experience only when we're dead, because to live is to be challenged for most of us. A traumatic stressor, fortunately, doesn't happen to a lot of us, but it takes a lot more out of us to experience them and to face them.
So can the low level stressors even be healthy for us because it's a challenge from day to day life?
Indeed, Robert Sapolsky has made that point, as have other researchers, that a certain amount of stress keeps us alive and be creative on how to solve problems. If those stressors didn't occur, then we would go through life very sheltered, and then we wouldn't be practicing our stress muscle, right? We wouldn't be rehearsing those things that we need to respond to the environment. And so then we might come across as kind of uncaring and unfeeling because we've never been challenged. So when somebody eventually does challenge us, then we respond in odd ways, in ways that other people might find disengaging or strange or uncaring. So yes, a certain amount of stress is necessary to keep life interesting. The adrenaline and cortisol that flows through your system during those moments of stress is probably good for our system, but it's all a matter of dose, right? How much stress and for how long, and then how we respond to it. And so there's the biology of stress, of the stress response, and then there's the psychology of the stress response. So if you are a highly sensitive person just from a nervous system perspective, then it'll take very little stressors for you to respond in a way that's probably not healthy. But if your nervous system, if you are fortunate to have a healthy nervous system, a very robust nervous system, then it's going to take more for you to respond in an unhealthy way. So I always tell my students, pick your parents really carefully because you get their genes.
Who is at risk of developing stress disorders like PTSD? And it sounds like it would be the people with maybe who have experienced either larger stressors or who have less robust nervous systems. Is that true?
Or people who have robust nervous systems but experience chronic stressors on a daily basis, right? So some of the publications, some of the papers that I've written focus on daily stressors. Those daily stressors, which over a period of time, because of the time factor, have now challenged the organism too much. It has taken too much brain power and nervous system power to keep responding. So in Sri Lanka, we found that children who were not able to go to school, their school bus doesn't come on time. And then when they do get to school, their teachers yell at them, or the teachers only teach those that they get private tutoring to and leave all the other kids out. Those kinds of daily stressors were showing up in the stress response of what we might call post-traumatic stress syndrome, just as much as the big T trauma stresses. So things like the bombings and the war-related stressors were pulling for a very similar response as those daily stressors. So yes, a dose response effect, but also chronicity is an important factor.
So when stressors accumulate, it can become a trauma through the chronic exposure.
So I would not necessarily say that a stressor becomes traumatic just from the exposure. You can have a daily stressor that calls for a response that eventually overcomes the organism, but I wouldn't still call that traumatic, right? So that's why that distinction between stressor and stress is so important, because the stressor can be daily, and because it's chronic, it eventually overwhelms the organism, even though it's not a traumatic stressor, right? So you can eventually get your stores of responses depleted, and just like the model of an extreme trauma, where you have the response of resistance and eventual exhaustion, you can have eventual exhaustion even from daily stressors, but you wouldn't necessarily call them traumatic stresses, right? So the response is not necessarily a traumatic stress response. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I'm trying to think of it in terms of sort of a metaphor. And what I was thinking was, it could be like a trauma, like a traumatic stressor might be like someone getting like drowning in the ocean and like a big wave, and then the chronic stressors might be like someone drinking too much water and actually drowning by drinking too much water.
Yes.
So it's
but
not
you wouldn't necessarily say that person was traumatized, right?
Right.
Right. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that and found it as fascinating as I did. And I want to thank Dr. Fernando for joining me. There's more information coming. If you do have any other ideas you want to share, go ahead and leave them in the comments. And if you do enjoy the content, go ahead and like and subscribe. Thank you guys so much, and hope you're well.